So I was just browsing through the technology and video game news, and I came across this story that really surprised me. And that is that NBA 2K21 is getting a $10 price increase for the standard edition on the next-gen consoles, PS5, Xbox Series X. So it'll be $69.99 instead of $59.99. And as I was kind of reading through this story, the speculation, of course, is will this be the standard video game price for next generation? And, it really irritated me because I think the question that you have to ask yourself is, have video games earned that price increase? Has the quality of the games that have come out over the past generation such that we can say, wow, what a leap that they've made? And, the future looks bright and they can only get better. And you know what? I'm willing to pay that extra money. Now, as you kind of research this online, the dominant argument, well, I suppose two dominant arguments are, games have become so much more complex. There's so much more work that goes into games. The assets are of a higher quality, so naturally you can't stay at $59.99. And, games have been at that price point since about 2005 when the PS3 and Xbox 360 launched. So if you adjust it for inflation, games are actually cheaper than ever. And I'm not going to go into that right now in detail. If you want to hear those arguments debunked, I suggest you watch Jim Sterling's channel, who kind of gives a pretty convincing argument for why that's nonsense. But I'm going to focus on the question, is it worth it to the consumer? Has the video game industry done enough to justify that price increase? And I think you have several points that speak to a very clear no. First of all, in the past generation, and arguably going back to PS3 and Xbox 360, the laziness on the part of developers has increased over that time. The fact that games are delivered to us in unpolished, unfinished states, that they need constant patching, the list is limitless, or just, in fact, that they don't live up to the hype and the technology claims of something like Anthem, for example, would be a poster boy for that. I just don't think the value, when you pay full price for a game these days, you might arguably get it in its worst state, and it's only after it's been patched and it's had 6 months to a year to mature, and maybe you get the Game of the Year edition, maybe you buy it used, maybe you get it on a sale. Only then might it be worth that initial $60 price point. Then you have, DLC, microtransactions, loot boxes, predatory gambling mechanics that have increased almost exponentially over the course of the past generation. So not only are these anti-consumer, they're irritating, they oftentimes ruin what may, as far as the nuts and bolts of the game, it might be a great game technically, it might have a great design, but your experience of the game, to me, is ruined by having those predatory elements in it. Now, these elements have kept gaming incredibly profitable. So this idea that video game companies are sort of bleeding cash and they're delivering us these great games at a cheap price and that we need pity for them and we should pay the extra $10 and, we need to buy into these microtransactions is nonsense. Bottom line is, if producing a video game, a AAA video game from these massive publishers, if that was no longer profitable, they would no longer do it. It's all about increasing shareholder value, maximizing profit. So the model is profitable enough to sustain a mega corporation. And to me, the $10 is only going to increase their profits. Next point I'd argue as to why it's not worth it is that, to me, video games, particularly AAA video games, have become rather standardized experiences. Companies are no longer taking risks. The games that come out are no longer interesting. I've talked about that a lot here, whether it's the cinematic Hollywood experience, whether it's the roster update sports game, whether it's the fighting game that focuses more on online and doesn't do much for the offline or the local multiplayer consumer. I mean, all of those things, it's like each game that comes out, no matter how technically advanced, no matter how broad in scope, nonetheless standardizes around a few types of experiences that are profitable or that are thought to be profitable. Then you have to also consider the horrible working conditions in the industry and the other sort of predatory practices that have just been revealed over the course of the past month. It is, I think, a kind of nasty industry that abuses everyone involved in it, whether it's the worker or the player. And when you consider the crunch time and the toll that producing a AAA video game takes on the developers and their families, again, you have to question, do you want to support that industry at a higher price point? And I would bet that that extra money, those $10, are not going to go to benefit those who are actually programming and putting in the blood, sweat, and tears to the games that we love. Now, this price increase is coming during what is either a recession or a depression. It's when the video game consumer, probably by and large, is at their most financially vulnerable. So you have to ask yourself, sort of the arrogance of these companies for not exploring other pricing practices. Now, for Xbox, and I'll give them credit, they have that subscription service, and I actually think that is a reasonable way to purchase modern games, because I don't think, if they're not worth the full price point, then I've found, whether it's EA Vault or the Xbox service, to pay whatever it is per month, $10, $15 a month, and maybe when I have time, if I know I'm going to have time to play games, say around the Christmas holiday, I'll pay for a month of that, and if I really get into a game, maybe I'll pay for another month so I can finish it. So I think that might be fair. I think Sony should explore that. Nintendo should explore that. I wouldn't have problems with variable pricing if, say, the next Grand Theft Auto game is really this massive technical undertaking, and you're not going to have any nickel and diming microtransaction DLC, and I can get a full polished game that really highlights the power of the next generation. I might be willing to pay $69.99, $79, maybe $100, but at the same time, the retro re-release, the kind of sports title that doesn't change from year to year, the games that are smaller in scope, maybe they can be $49.99. So if they had said, listen, you're going to be able to buy games at all different price points for this new platform, for these new platforms, then I might be a little bit more sympathetic. And lastly, I'm going to come back to a quote by video game developer Amy Hennig. I've referenced this a few times on the channel. A couple of years ago, she essentially asked the question, when you look at everything on balance, when you look at the kind of pain and suffering and negative working conditions that those who produce video games live and work under, when you consider all of the different predatory practices and machinations that the consumer has to go through in modern gaming, when you take all of that into account and you look at the final product, is that final product worth the pain? Is your experience of playing that brand new game, does that experience justify what goes into it and the expense, the suffering, and the predatory practices? And I have to say that, at least for me, the answer is a resounding no.